I want to tell you something I have never said out loud before. Not to my solicitor. Not to my closest friend. Not even to myself, at 2 in the morning, when the truth tends to come looking for you whether you invite it or not. For 3 years, my family took everything I built. One piece at a time. So slowly that by the time I understood what was happening, half of it was already gone. It started with a signature on a form I didn't read carefully enough. It ended with me standing in a courtroom at 76 years old, watching my own son's face as a judge read out a ruling that would change everything for both of us. My name is Rosalind. I built a life, a business, and a home over 45 years. And then, one signature at a time, my family tried to take it all. This is the whole story. Stay with me until the end. The ending is the part one I'm proudest of. I was born in 1950. My father died in a factory accident when I was 6. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep us fed. I left school at 16. I needed to work. At 22, I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small furniture maker called Hartley & Sons. It was owned by a quiet, serious widower named Edmund. He was raising a 4-year-old son, Geoffrey, alone. I did not fall in love with Edmund quickly. I fell in love with him slowly. Watching him stay up late doing accounts after his workers had gone home. Watching him read bedtime stories to a boy who had lost his mother. We married in 1975. I was 25. Geoffrey was 7. From the day of our wedding, I raised him as my own. Completely. I want you to remember that, because it matters enormously to everything that happens later. Edmund and I had 2 more children. Diane, born in 1977. Patrick, born in 1980. 3 children. 1 family. No favorites. We built the furniture business together through the 70s and 80s. We bought our house in 1979, a big old Victorian place with a large garden. We called it Thornfield. The name stuck for 45 years. Edmund died in 2009. A heart attack, in his sleep, beside me, on an ordinary Tuesday. I was 59. I had been married for 34 years. I did not retreat. I ran the business alone for another 12 years. I sold it in 2021 for just over £2 million. I kept Thornfield. I kept my independence. I believed I kept the complete trust of my 3 children. I was wrong about that last part. I just didn't know it yet. I need to introduce my 3 children properly, because each one plays a very different part in what follows. Geoffrey, my stepson, was 56 when this story begins. I never once called him my stepson, not even privately. He had helped run the business and, after the sale, invested his share into a property development with his wife Pamela. Pamela had grown up genuinely poor. That history never left her. It made her capable, I would learn, of justifying almost anything in the name of security. Diane, my daughter, was 48. An accountant. Married to a quiet, decent man named Robert. She had always been the most independent of the 3. I sometimes mistook her independence for distance. I was wrong about that too. Patrick, my youngest, was 44. Bright, restless, always between business ventures that started with excitement and ended in debt. I had bailed him out 4 times over 2 decades. His wife had left him 18 months before this story begins, taking their daughter with her. If you had asked me, 3 years before this story begins, I would have told you Geoffrey was the child I trusted most. That Diane was the one I worried about least. That Patrick was the one whose troubles I expected to keep managing forever. I was wrong about all 3. And the person who set it all in motion was not, in the end, any of my children directly. It was Pamela. It began, as these things often do, with something that looked like ordinary family kindness. I had a small health scare, a fainting spell in the garden, nothing serious, just dehydration. But it frightened everyone. Geoffrey and Pamela visited the next weekend. Full of concern. They suggested I set up what Pamela called a safety net. A power of attorney. Something to let Geoffrey step in quickly if anything more serious ever happened. It sounded sensible. Loving, even. Pamela had a solicitor friend, Trevor, who could draw it up quickly. I agreed. I did not have my own solicitor check at first. I trusted my son. I want you to sit with that sentence. I trusted my son. I think every person watching this has, at some point, trusted someone they loved enough to skip reading the fine print. What I did not understand, what I would not understand for over a year, was that the document Trevor drew up was not a simple safety net. It gave Geoffrey real power immediately. Not just in an emergency. And it could be used through other papers I might sign without fully reading, in the ordinary trusting way families sign things for each other. My eventual solicitor would later call it, with barely concealed fury, a masterclass in dressing up exploitation as ordinary paperwork. I signed it on a Tuesday afternoon. I made everyone tea. I thought nothing more of it for over a year. 14 months later, Geoffrey came to me with what he called an incredible opportunity. He and Pamela wanted to convert an old mill building into luxury apartments. The projected returns, he said, spreading glossy plans across my kitchen table, were extraordinary. He needed an investor. £400,000. I was cautious. I had run a business for decades. I knew projected returns and actual returns are different animals. I asked questions. Geoffrey had every answer ready, smoothly, immediately, which, looking back, should have worried me more than it reassured me. I agreed to invest $200,000. Not the full amount. I insisted on a proper loan agreement, with interest, secured against the mill property itself. Trevor drew that agreement up too. I did not have it independently checked. Again. What I did not discover for almost a year was this: the agreement Trevor wrote did not secure my loan against the mill. It secured it against Thornfield. My own home. The mill project ran into trouble almost immediately. Planning delays. Cost overruns. Geoffrey's updates arrived later and later, and told me less and less. I felt, for the first time, a particular discomfort. Not lied to outright. Just managed. I did not yet understand how completely I was being managed. I would understand it 11 months later, reading a letter from a solicitor I had never heard of, about a charge on my own home. It was my daughter Diane who first said the thing nobody else would say. She visited one Sunday and stayed behind after her family left. She sat very still at my kitchen table, the way you sit before a hard conversation. She said, "Mum, I need to ask you something. Do you actually know what's happening with the mill project? Geoffrey told Robert at golf that it's basically failed. He said he's working on, his words, managing the situation with you." I said, managing the situation. My first instinct was to defend Geoffrey. 34 years of trust doesn't unwind in one Sunday conversation. Diane said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "Mum, as an accountant, I have seen what this looks like. It is never one big theft. It is 100 small reasonable steps that only look terrible when you see the whole picture at once." She said, "Get your own solicitor. Not Trevor. Your own. Have them check everything you've signed in the last 2 years. This week." I did not act on it that week. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself Geoffrey would never. I acted on it 6 weeks later, when the letter arrived. The letter came from a solicitor's firm I had never heard of. It was about a charge registered against Thornfield, connected to the mill development. I read it twice before I understood it. The mill development had gone badly over budget. The lender was calling in their loan. And because of how the paperwork was structured, my home, the home where I had raised 3 children for 45 years, was at risk of being taken to cover their debt. I sat at my kitchen table for over an hour before I could move. Then I called Diane. She arrived within 90 minutes, having driven faster than was strictly legal. She read the letter twice, going progressively pale. She said, "Mum, we need a real solicitor. Today. Not Trevor." Diane found me a solicitor named Imogen. Sharp, methodical, experienced in exactly this kind of case, older clients, family exploitation, the slow kind that hides inside ordinary paperwork. Imogen spent 3 weeks going through everything I had signed. What she found made me physically sick. There was a third document. One I had no memory of signing at all. It removed a protection that Edmund had built into his original will, decades earlier, a protection that meant Thornfield could never be put at risk no matter what other financial trouble arose. Without that protection removed, my home could never have been used as security for the mill loan in the first place. I stared at my own signature on that document for a long time. It was mine. I recognized my own handwriting. I had no memory of signing it. Imogen asked, gently, "Is it possible this was put in front of you among other papers, during a visit, signed quickly without it registering?" I thought about 18 months of Sunday visits. Geoffrey arriving with folders already prepared. Tea being poured. Grandchildren running through the garden. My own trusting signature appearing on paper after paper while I believed I was simply helping my son. I said, "Yes. It's possible." I confronted Geoffrey on a Wednesday evening, in my own kitchen, with Imogen's report on the table and Diane beside me. I had hoped, in some quiet desperate corner of myself, for an explanation. That he would go pale with genuine shock and say, "Mum, I had no idea Trevor structured it this way." That is not what happened. Geoffrey looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he said, "Mum, it's not as bad as it looks." I said, "My house is at risk because of a loan I gave you." Explain how that is not as bad as it looks. He said the charge against the house was always meant to be temporary. That it was just how commercial loans worked. A worst-case scenario built into the paperwork that almost never actually happens. I said, "It is happening right now, Geoffrey." Then Diane asked the question I could not bring myself to ask. She said, "Did you and Pamela deliberately structure these documents to get access to Mum's assets beyond what she actually agreed to?" The silence lasted almost 20 full seconds. Geoffrey finally said, "Pamela handled most of the paperwork. I trusted her judgment. I didn't go through every clause myself either, if I'm honest." I said, "You didn't go through every clause yourself either." I let that sentence sit, because it mirrored my own failure exactly. And it still wasn't an answer to Diane's question. I said, "Geoffrey, I raised you from the age of 4. I never treated you as anything other than my own son. Did you know, at any point, that these documents gave you more access to my home than I had actually agreed to?" He looked at the table. He said, "I knew the structure was generous to us. I told myself it was just a safety net. I told myself you'd never need to know the details because the development was going to succeed." I said, "You knew." He did not deny it again. I want to tell you the story might have stayed contained to Geoffrey and Pamela's mill project. It did not. Imogen's investigation found something else. My youngest son Patrick, struggling with yet another failing business, this one online retail, had used the power of attorney, 8 months earlier, to move £45,000 out of one of my savings accounts and into his company. I had not authorized it. I had not known about it. The record showed Geoffrey had approved the transfer. I sat in Imogen's office and cried properly for the first time since Edmund's funeral, 15 years earlier. Because here is what that single fact did to me. It told me Geoffrey had not just been careless or badly advised. He had known, months before our confrontation, that he had the power to move my money without my consent. And he had used it. For Patrick. While telling me nothing. I confronted Patrick alone, the next day, without Diane. He cried before I had finished my first sentence. He said, "Mum, I was desperate. Geoffrey said you'd never even notice £45,000 was missing from an account that size. He said he'd put it back before you needed it." I said, "He told you I'd never notice." Patrick said, "I know how it sounds." I was drowning, and my own brother offered me a way to keep my head above water, and I didn't ask enough questions, because I was too scared of what would happen if I didn't take it. I found some compassion for Patrick, even then. His weakness was old and familiar. Desperation making poor choices. The same pattern as his 4 previous bailouts. Wrong. A betrayal. But recognizably Patrick. What I could not find compassion for, not yet, was Geoffrey's calculation. Geoffrey had not been desperate. Geoffrey had been strategic. Imogen called me in one final time, 3 weeks later, with what she called the complete picture. Over 3 years, my family had moved my home, my money, and my trust, piece by piece, in ways that benefited them and put me at risk. My home was at risk of repossession over a debt I never agreed it would secure. £45,000 had gone to Patrick's business without my knowledge. A further £63,000 had gone to Geoffrey and Pamela directly, as fees for managing my affairs under the power of attorney. Fees I never agreed to and was never told about. And the document removing Thornfield's lifetime protection had been drawn up specifically to allow the house to be used as the mill's security in the first place. Without that signature, none of the rest could have happened. In total, well over £300,000 had been moved, risked, or quietly taken, alongside the threat to a home worth far more than that. I asked Imogen the question that had been building in me for 6 weeks. Was this planned from the very beginning? She said, "Sometimes it is. More often, in my experience, it starts smaller and grows as people discover how much access they actually have, and how little resistance they meet. But the document removing your home's protection, that was not opportunism. That was a deliberate, strategic decision by someone who understood exactly what they were doing." I went home that evening and sat in Edmund's old chair, something I had not been able to do in 15 years. I made a decision. I called Imogen the next morning and said 3 words. Take everything back. Diane did not simply warn me and step back. Once the full picture began to emerge, she became the engine of my entire response. She checked every document Imogen produced, often catching details even Imogen missed. She found the original planning surveyor and discovered the mill's cost overruns came largely from Geoffrey and Pamela's own unauthorized, expensive design changes, not genuine planning delays as Geoffrey had claimed. She found a forensic document examiner who confirmed the missing memory document had likely been slipped into a stack of other papers for signing, a recognized technique for obtaining consent without genuine attention. I asked her once why she was working so hard on something that was, after all, primarily my fight. She looked genuinely surprised by the question. She said, "Mom, you raised the 3 of us completely equally your whole life. You ran that business alone for 12 years and never asked any of us to bail you out of anything. This is not just your fight. What they did to you is an insult to everything you actually are, and I am not going to sit quietly because confronting my brothers is uncomfortable. I want to tell you that hearing my daughter say those words repaired something 3 years of slow betrayal had been quietly breaking." Imogen filed the first legal actions in February, 14 months before I am telling you this. There were 3 parts to the strategy. First, an application to cancel the power of attorney entirely and reverse anything done under it without my genuine consent. Second, a claim to recover the money, the unauthorized fees and Patrick's transfer. Third, an application to undo the document that had stripped Thornfield's protection, removing the threat to my home completely. Trevor, the solicitor who drafted everything, resigned from his firm within 3 weeks of being served. He did not contest Imogen's account of how the documents were structured. His silence, Imogen said, was nearly as useful as a confession. Geoffrey and Pamela fought every part of it. Their argument was simple: I had signed everything of my own free will, as a sophisticated former business owner, and regret afterward was not grounds to undo it. I will be honest about how brutal this period was. The proceedings stretched across 11 months. I gave evidence 3 times, walking through every detail while their barrister suggested, politely but relentlessly, that a woman of my background could not reasonably claim to have been confused by paperwork she chose to sign. There were nights I genuinely did not know whether I would win. Diane drove 90 minutes on those nights, just to sit with me until I could sleep. The case turned, 8 months in, from a source none of us expected. Patrick, watching his brother's lawyers paint me as a fully knowing participant in everything, came to me privately. He said, "Mum, I can't sit there and watch them call you sophisticated and knowing, when I know exactly how this actually happened." Geoffrey told me himself. Against his own solicitor's advice, and at real legal cost to himself, Patrick agreed to give a formal statement. He described Geoffrey telling him directly that I would never even notice the £45,000, and that the power of attorney basically meant we could move things around without walking her through every detail. That statement was devastating to Geoffrey's defense in a way no amount of paperwork analysis had managed. It was direct evidence, from inside the family, of intent. I asked Patrick afterward why he had done something so damaging to his own position. He said, "Mum, I've spent my whole life being the disappointing one. I'm not proud of taking that money. I made a terrible choice and I have to live with it. But I am not going to add lying about Geoffrey's part to that list. You deserve the truth more than I deserve to protect myself." I held my youngest son's hand across my kitchen table. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt something that was not pure grief. I felt the beginning of repair. The Court of Protection ruled first, 6 weeks after Patrick's statement. Justice Whitfield cancelled the power of attorney entirely. She found it had been obtained and used in a way that was financial abuse of a vulnerable family member, despite, her own words, the applicant's evident competence and sophistication. That phrase mattered enormously. It directly dismantled their whole defense. Being capable does not make you immune to exploitation by people you trust completely. The money claim concluded 4 weeks later. Full repayment of the fees, with interest. Full repayment of the £45,000, though Patrick, given his cooperation, was allowed a 4-year payment plan, while Geoffrey's share had to be paid within 90 days. The case about my home concluded last, 3 months after that, and it mattered the most. Justice Whitfield set the whole thing aside. My home's protection was fully restored, exactly as Edmund had built it 49 years earlier. The charge against Thornfield was declared invalid. The risk of losing my own home, after a year of hanging over me, was gone. In her written ruling, she wrote something Imogen said was unusually direct. She wrote that this case showed a pattern courts increasingly see: the slow, methodical exploitation of an elderly parent, carried out not through dramatic theft but through a sequence of individually defensible-seeming steps, relying on genuine family trust to hide their combined effect. She called it, plainly, financial abuse. I read that paragraph perhaps 15 times the evening I received it. I am 76 years old. I built everything I have through 45 years of honest work. A judge I had never met before this ordeal looked at the whole shape of what had been done to me, and called it exactly what it was. I cannot tell you how much that mattered. I have not spoken much about what happened to my relationship with Geoffrey, because it is the hardest part of this story for me to tell, even now. He paid everything he was ordered to pay, on time. But throughout the whole 11 months, he never once offered me an apology I would call genuine. His statements stayed framed around legal technicalities, never around what he had actually done to me as his mother. I saw him by accident 8 months after the final ruling, at a garden center I had visited for 40 years and had no intention of avoiding. He looked older. Thinner. We stood in an aisle of plant pots for a long, awkward moment. He said, "Mum, I think about it." "What happened?" "More than you probably believe." I said, "What do you think about, exactly?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think about the fact that you raised me from the age of 4 like your own son, and somewhere along the way I let Pamela's fear about money convince me that taking from you wasn't really taking. Surely you had so much. Surely you wouldn't notice. Family is family. And I think about how wrong that was. How much I actually knew it mattered, even while I was telling myself it didn't. It was the closest thing to a real apology I had received from him. I said, "Geoffrey, I am not ready to have you back in my life the way you once were. I don't know if I ever will be. But I heard what you just said, and I believe, for the first time in 3 years, that some part of it was actually true." He nodded. He did not push for more. We have spoken perhaps 6 times since. Pamela and I have not spoken at all. That relationship, I have come to accept, may simply be over. I want to give you the full, honest picture of where my family stands today, because a messy truth is worth more than a tidy ending. Thornfield is mine. Fully and permanently protected, exactly as Edmund intended. I sleep, for the first time in over a year, without the quiet hum of anxiety about whether I will still own my own home in 6 months. The full amount, plus interest and most of my legal costs, has been recovered or is on a confirmed repayment plan. Imogen tells me a complete recovery like this is unusual, and credits much of it to Diane's relentless work, and to Patrick's costly honesty. Diane and I speak most days now. We have started, slowly, restoring Edmund's old rose garden, which had fallen into neglect during the years I was too frightened to tend to anything beyond survival. Patrick is rebuilding, slowly. His latest business finally, mercifully, failed completely 6 months ago, a hard ending, but a necessary one. He has a steady job now, unglamorous but reliable, and calls every Sunday evening, a habit that started during the worst months and simply continued. Geoffrey and I remain at a careful, polite distance. I do not know what we will become. I have stopped needing to know, which has been, unexpectedly, a relief. I have a new solicitor, Imogen, managing my affairs now, with a properly restricted power of attorney held jointly by Diane and herself, requiring both signatures for anything significant. I will never again sign something important without independent review. That lesson, I am grateful to say, I have learned completely. I have thought, through all of this telling, about what I most want you to take from it. The first thing, trust is not the enemy here. I do not regret loving my children completely. I would not unmake that trust, even knowing what it eventually cost me. A life lived in permanent suspicion of the people you love most is its own kind of poverty. What I would change, if I could speak to myself 18 months before this began, is not the trust itself, but the diligence that should have gone with it. Trust your children. Love them completely. And still, always, read every document independently. These two things are not in conflict. I spent decades believing they were. I was wrong. Diligence is one of the ways love protects itself. The second thing, trust your own instincts. For 3 years, small unease told me something was wrong. I dismissed it as paranoia. I want every person watching who feels that same vague unease about their own finances to take it seriously far sooner than I did. That instinct is very rarely wrong. It is just quieter and more easily silenced than it deserves to be. The third thing, and the one I am proudest of, do not let fear of family conflict stop you from pursuing the full truth. I could have settled quietly, accepting partial repayment in exchange for avoiding 11 brutal months in court. Many people in my position do exactly that. I understand why. But I am 76 years old. I built everything I have through 45 years of honest work. I was not willing to let it be quietly diminished simply because the truth was uncomfortable for everyone involved. I fought. Completely. Without apology. And what I recovered was not only the money and the house, but something harder to name, complete clarity about exactly who my children actually are, underneath the comfortable assumptions I had carried about them for decades. To everyone watching who feels that same vague unease right now, about a power of attorney signed too quickly, about a child managing your money with slightly too much enthusiasm, get your own solicitor. This week. Not because you assume the worst, but because the people who truly love you should want you to have that protection too. And if they resist you seeking it, that resistance tells you something important on its own. Thornfield is mine. My name is on every document that matters, reviewed independently, fully understood before I sign a single line. I am 76 years old, and for the first time in 3 years, I am sleeping soundly in my own house, in my own life, certain of exactly what belongs to me. If Rosalind's story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe. If you have ever felt that same vague unease about family finances, please take it seriously, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell me in the comments, at what point did you first suspect what was really happening? I read every comment. I told you the story I just finished was the complete picture, as Imogen first presented it. I want to admit now that wasn't quite the whole truth. There was one more thread, one I did not learn until almost a year after the final ruling. I saved it for the end because it changes how I understand everything that came before it. About 10 months after the proceedings ended, a woman I had never met called me. Her name was Linda. She had been Pamela's closest friend for 15 years, until a falling out the previous spring she would only describe as something I could not forgive. She had followed my case in the local paper. She said she had something she thought I needed to see, and had been wrestling for months over whether to come forward. I invited her to Thornfield. What she showed me was a personal ledger, handwritten, in Pamela's own hand. Linda had photographed it 18 months earlier, when she and Pamela were still close enough that Pamela had shown it to her, almost boastfully, one evening. The ledger outlined a longer plan than anything Imogen had uncovered. Pamela's own words, underlined twice, described securing our position before the others get any ideas. It described, in its early stages, a plan to gently encourage me toward a smaller property, framed as being for my own comfort, which would free Thornfield for sale, with the proceeds managed through the same power of attorney, before Diane or Patrick ever understood what was happening to their own inheritance. I sat with that ledger for a long time. I said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? 18 months ago, when the case began?" Linda said, "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself it was just frustrated talk that would never actually become action. I was wrong to believe that, and it has made me sick for months." I called Imogen that same evening. Imogen moved quickly. The ledger was new evidence of an ongoing intention to exploit the situation, even after the original power of attorney had been cancelled. It supported a fresh application, a protective order, declaring that any future attempt by Geoffrey or Pamela to influence decisions about my home or my finances would be treated by the court as automatically suspect, requiring independent verification before anything could proceed. Geoffrey and Pamela's lawyers fought this harder than the original case. They argued the ledger was private musing, never acted on. Pamela gave evidence for the first time in the whole process. Her account shifted 3 times under questioning. First she called it a fantasy. Then, when confronted with a dated entry matching a real conversation we'd had 6 weeks earlier, she claimed the ideas were Geoffrey's, not hers. When reminded the entire document was in her own handwriting, in the first person, she fell silent for a stretch the court record simply describes as witness does not respond. Justice Whitfield granted the protective order in full. She wrote that financial exploitation of this kind rarely ends cleanly with a single ruling. It is an ongoing risk, requiring ongoing protection, especially where, as here, the evidence suggested the original intention had never been fully abandoned, only interrupted. I read that ruling at my kitchen table, the same table where this entire story began with an innocent-looking signature years earlier. I felt something settle in my chest I had not realized was still unsettled. Completion. I confronted Geoffrey one final time after the second ruling. Not in anger. I owed it to both of us to say the complete truth out loud, one last time, before closing this chapter. He came alone. Pamela had moved into a rented flat across town 3 months earlier. Whether from the strain of it all, or from Geoffrey's own slow understanding of what she had really been planning, I never asked. I made tea, out of habit more than hospitality. I said, "Geoffrey, did you know about the plan to sell Thornfield?" He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I knew Pamela had ideas about it. I told myself I would stop it if it ever became real. But I have to be honest with you, even this late, there was a part of me, during the worst of the mill collapse, terrified of losing everything, that thought about it as a possibility. Not as a plan. Just a thought. And I am more ashamed of that thought than almost anything else, because it means some part of me was capable of even considering it." I sat with that for a long moment. I said, "Thank you for finally telling me the truth." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we both know exactly what our relationship is and isn't capable of being. I won't pretend the last 4 years didn't happen. I won't pretend I trust you the way I once did. But I also won't pretend you aren't my son. You are. You have been since you were 4 years old. That doesn't stop being true because you did something terrible." He cried, properly, for the first time in this whole story. I did not rush to comfort him the way I once would have. He needed to feel the full weight of it without me softening it the way I had softened so many things for him across 49 years. It was, in its way, the most honest conversation we have ever had. I want to tell you about the rose garden, because it holds something the legal victories couldn't quite capture. Edmund planted it in 1985, working through 3 weekends with a 16-year-old Geoffrey, while I sat on the back step with baby Patrick and watched Diane running circles around them, demanding to help with a trowel too big for her hands. That garden had been the heart of Thornfield for decades. During the 3 years of slow betrayal, I had let it go completely. I was too distracted, too exhausted, to tend to something that needed patient, hopeful attention. Diane and I began restoring it the spring after the second ruling. Most Sunday afternoons, the two of us, pulling weeds, finding, here and there, a rose bush that had survived years of neglect through sheer stubbornness. Patrick joined most weekends too, once his new job allowed it. He was, predictably, terrible at gardening. He showed up anyway, every week, and that mattered more than his technique. By midsummer, it was alive again. Diane's teenage children joined too, eventually competing over who could name more of Edmund's original rose varieties, names I taught them slowly, over a series of Sunday afternoons that began to feel like a kind of inheritance more valuable than any of the money at the center of this whole story. I stood in that garden one evening in late July, watching my grandchildren argue cheerfully over a bloom, Patrick and Diane sitting on the old bench Edmund built with his own hands 40 years earlier. I understood something. The money mattered. The house mattered enormously, I will not pretend otherwise. But what actually healed something in me was this garden. Sunday afternoons. Showing up, patiently, the way Edmund had shown up to plant it in the first place. I want to tell you about my friend Brenda, because something happened after my story became known locally that I did not expect. After the local paper covered the ruling, Brenda began hearing things, from women at church, at the garden center, at the hairdresser's where half the town's older women still go on a Friday out of 40 years of habit. She began hearing, in careful, hesitant fragments, that I was not the only one. A woman named Audrey, 81, confided that her own son had been helping with the accounts for 3 years, in a way that meant she couldn't touch her own savings without his approval. She had simply accepted it as how things were now, until she heard about my case and finally asked whether that was actually right. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you every family arrangement is exploitation. Most adult children helping aging parents are doing exactly what they appear to be doing, genuine, loving help. I do not want this story to make you suspicious of every kind thing your children have ever done for you. But the pattern I lived through, the slow, gradual normalizing of reduced independence, dressed in the comfortable language of family help, turned out to be far more common than I had ever imagined. Imogen told me her own caseload of similar matters had grown nearly 40% over 3 years. Rising property values. An aging population. More situations where adult children end up managing a parent's affairs with varying degrees of appropriate boundary. Audrey eventually got her own solicitor. She found restrictions on her own accounts she had never formally agreed to. She has full control of her finances again now, and calls me most months simply to tell me how it feels to be in charge of her own life. I did not set out to become any kind of spokesperson for this. I simply told my story honestly, and the ripples traveled further than I ever expected. This story does not have a perfectly clean ending. Geoffrey and I remain at careful distance. Pamela and I are likely apart for good. The money is recovered, the house is protected, the protective order stands. But the specific trust one once had in my eldest son, built over 49 years, was not something any court ruling could fully restore. Some things, once broken a certain way, simply stay broken. I have made my peace with that. What I have instead is something I value more than the clean ending I once wanted. Clarity. A garden that blooms again. A daughter who drove 90 minutes at illegal speeds the moment I called her. A youngest son who chose, at real cost to himself, the truth over a comfortable lie. I have my home. My name is on every document that matters. I have the complete truth about exactly who loves me, exactly how, and exactly what that love can and cannot withstand under pressure. That truth cost me a great deal. I would pay that cost again. Every single time. Without hesitation. Thank you for staying with Rosalind's complete story. If it moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear every word of it.